It's really lovely to be here with you guys this morning and to get to welcome you to Konstanz. The weather has turned for us. I was a little worried this morning, but I'm glad it's sunny and beautiful. And to talk to you a little bit about, I'm going to start by talking a little bit about sort of the broader scope of what we are trying to do in my department here and kind of where I want us to be in 15 years. Well, okay, I've actually signed a paper with my retirement date. I retire in 2047. So by the time I retire, where I would like us to be, and then turn to some sort of new stuff that we're doing in my lab that I'm really excited about, which is maybe a little strange, but I'll explain the connection. Maybe a strange connection, but I'll explain it. But so to start, I sort of want to pull back out a little bit. So I don't know what I am. I'm a scientist with a identity crisis. When I'm around ecologists, I'm an anthropologist. When I'm around anthropologists, I'm an ecologist. But basically, I study animal behavior, and I focus primarily on primates. But today, I want to start by pulling out and thinking about us as a species. And specifically, oh, my slides are not advancing. You know, what is it that makes us different? And when I think about it, human uniqueness, what sort of sets us apart from all the other species on the planet. I think human uniqueness lies not so much in the characteristics or traits, biological traits of individuals, but instead in what happens when groups of people come together and interact. We're a we're a hypersocial species with a extremely flexible social system. And an unusual capacity to work together to achieve shared goals. So whether we're talking about our languages, which create shared meaning, our ability to cooperate with non-kin and with strangers at large scales, or the technologies that are really only possible due to the cumulative nature of our culture, the fact that we can learn from the advances of others and build upon those. We're a species that is really dependent upon our collective adaptations. And this has led to tremendous ecological success. Despite our origins as a tropical ape, we've spread across the world and we basically, we inhabit every ecosystem on the planet. And so this leads to the question, how do we come to be such an unusual ape? And this is the kind of question that gets asked in philosophy departments, religious studies departments, gets asked in economics and psychology. But I think that there really is an important biological question to be asked here as well, because we are far from the only species that relies heavily on our complex social systems and the ability of groups to do more than any single individual can accomplish. And we're in luck because so from a biological perspective, transitions from solitary lifestyles to group living and from loose aggregations into, can I make this go way up at the top so you can? Thank you. So yeah, from loose aggregations where individuals don't necessarily have defined inter-individual relationships with specific other animals into these highly integrated, socially differentiated societies have happened a number of times over evolutionary history. And while primates in general and humans in particular have made complex social lifestyles the centerpiece of our adaptation, we're far from alone on this reliance on social bonds. All animals that live in social groups, and particularly kind of stable social groups, live their lives embedded in this rich network of social relationships. And the relationships are multifaceted. So who you're friends with, even as a monkey, is not necessarily the same as who you sleep with or who you play with or who you forage with. And these networks are dynamic and evolving over time. So who I'm hanging out with today is not necessarily who I'll be hanging out with a year from now. And so from my perspective, what this means is that if we want to understand complex social systems, how our society, but also the society of other socially complex animals emerge and how they function, it's not enough to understand individuals' behavioral tendencies, how individuals will decide what to do and when to do it, but you have to understand those decision-making processes in a social context. And with advance apologies to genomicists and proteomicists, we need to be able to develop methods that allow us to identify, understand, and quantify the social relationships and behavioral processes that drive these complex social interactions. We need to develop a science of the sociome. And this matters, I mean, when you think about from an ecological perspective, the kinds of factors that we think shape the way individuals interact, the kinds of relationships they have, the way their societies are formed. We have a whole bunch of, primate socioecology has 3 decades worth of verbal theories about how the distribution of food resources and competition between groups and within groups drives the structuring of societies. But you can also then end up with a situation like this. So what you're seeing here at the top are 2 pictures of bonobos and 2 pictures of chimpanzees, very closely related primate species that look very similar superficially in a lot of ways. So they live in the same very similar kinds of forests. They live in very similar kinds of societies where the males stay in their natal groups and females disperse at sexual maturity. But the tenor of the dynamics of these 2 societies is incredibly different. Bonobo societies are structured around female-female social bonds and are comparatively peaceful, and really female power serves to bring down aggression levels and sort of contain male aggression. In contrast, chimpanzee societies are structured around male-male social bonds, and you have significant within and between group aggression as sort of one of the, I mean, you just have to sit with these 2 species in the forest. It's a completely different feel to their societies. So how does this kind of diversity come to be within very similar ecologies, very similar kinds of animals eating very similar kinds of diets? How do we get this kind of social diversity? Well, I think to answer this question in the big picture, there's a series of things that we need to be able to understand and that currently we're only beginning to really untangle. So we need to not only understand what causes variation in behavior at the individual level. So why is one of these banded mongooses kind of up front in the mobbing group, whereas the other's hanging back, looks like he's about ready to turn and run away? Well, we need to be able to understand the ways in which the choices individuals make impact the choices other individuals in their group make. So the contingencies of behavior. We then need to be able to combine those sort of decision-making rules to understand how the independent decisions or the interrelated decisions of all of these individuals combine to create group-level behaviors. How does this group come to mob the snake? And then ultimately, we need to be able to understand how these group-level actions feed back to shape the social environment that impacts the individuals living in the group and that shapes the selective pressures that are impacting their survival and reproduction. So one of the problems with trying to build the science of a sociome comes down to inadequacies in the ways in which we are able to collect data on social interactions, and particularly social interactions at the more than dyadic level. So this is actually the best video I have of baboons. This is actually really nice visibility. You can see the group moving across. And the methods that we have for studying animals in the wild are really quite good at, I'm gonna move away from the speaker for a second. If you want to know what that guy's doing, sure, our methods are good for that. We can do focal animal follows. We can record what this male is doing, who he's interacting with. But you miss out on the social context of what everything else that's going on in the group. We don't have a way really, or until recently, we haven't had ways of capturing data that allows us to look at the social contingencies of behavioral decisions. And our obsessions with our cell phones have really helped to have created new avenues for solving some of these problems. So the consumer pressure that has driven the miniaturization and better power use capacities of a variety of remote sensing technologies has also now made it possible to basically put the same technology that's in your cell phone on animals. And when you do this on entire groups, what you can do is simultaneously record data on what every individual in a group is doing. So what you're seeing here is another baboon troop moving across a landscape in the plateau, in the Laikipia province of Kenya, central Kenya, up on the high plateau. They're colored according to their age, sex class. And each of these individuals is wearing a collar that is not only recording GPS data, but also accelerometry. So we can know what they're, not only where they are, but what they're doing. They also have an acoustic recorder attached, so we know what they're saying. And these sorts of data allow us to resolve networks, not only in very aggregated form, so normally using focal animal following, you have to aggregate it over large time periods to get enough data. We can sort of have this continuous dynamic network of social relationships across time. But it also allows us to look at questions like decision-making. So you saw this group come up to this sort of green area of thick vegetation. Do they go left? Do they go right? There was a bit of a, I don't know, tension in the group over that decision. They ultimately went, is that right? That's right. Sorry, I'm a bit left-right dyslexic. And so interestingly, what we find with these baboons, so baboons have these very despotic hierarchical societies where the adult males can monopolize the best food, the best mates. They don't monopolize the decision-making process, though. When we look across this GPS tracking data, what we find is that decision-making, at least in terms of where to go on the landscape, it's sort of like small-scale decisions about how to navigate the landscape, are a straight-up voting process. It's a majority rule. We can then take sort of this kind of data using remote sensing, whether it's via drone or satellite, and embed these social decisions within the environment in which they're being made. So what you're seeing here is it's the same baboon troop moving across the landscape. This is not a particularly pretty reconstruction. We can do better now, but I mean, what you're seeing here basically the topography of the ground plus the trees and rocks and stuff. And from a baboon perspective, what you can see at any given point in time, who you can see within your group, those sort of sightline connections, as well as the acoustic auditory connections, really change the information that's available to you. And so being able to understand from a baboon's perspective, or any other species, what they can see, what they can hear, allows us to ask questions about how they make decisions. And interestingly, what we find is that where decisions are made actually has an impact on how decisions are made. So I said that baboon spatial decision-making is a democratic majority rule process. Yes, until you put them on a road. And then all of a sudden the group decision-making rule changes. When you put baboons on, when baboons get onto a road, it takes a supermajority to get them off the road again. I think baboons like walking on roads because it's easy. It's flat, it's straight. So in my department, what we're doing is collecting standardized data sets. So using all of these different, this sort of suite of technologies, this suite of environmental sensing data collection approaches to create comparable data sets across whole ranges of species. We're focused primarily on social mammals. So we're doing work on social carnivores, work on primates, work on bats, trying to build this comparative data set that's going to allow us to look at questions like, how does decision-making differ across species? How does it differ according to context? How is influence exerted in different kinds of social structures? But today, what I want to talk about is sort of a new area of research for us that focuses on our baboon work. And hopefully you guys aren't asleep yet, sort of strangely. We're going to be talking about sleep, which is not perhaps what you might think of as the most social of social processes. But it's this area that we're increasingly interested in, that I'm increasingly interested in. And I'm interested in it because I don't know how many of you have kids, but if you do, you know that animals that live in groups don't sleep in isolation. If you live in a group, you sleep in a group, and your sleep becomes sort of a social process that is coupled with the dynamics of the individuals around you. And despite this fact, and despite the fact that humans throughout the majority of our evolutionary history, as well as today, humans outside of the industrialized world primarily sleep socially, we tend to study sleep only as a solitary process. We study it in laboratory settings with lone individuals. But this, again, coming back to this revolution in consumer electronics, how many people here have a Fitbit or an Oura Ring or a... People are increasingly tracking their own sleep in the wild. And as we study human sleep in the wild, what we're finding is that not only is sleep social, but there's this self-reinforcing, there seems to be this self-reinforcing feedback loop between sleep loss, so underslept. And being underslept causes deficits in your social cognition and leads to social isolation. And social isolation also seems to feed back and lead to poor sleep outcomes. So from my perspective, this is important. So this is US data, but look to your left, look to your right. One of the three of you didn't sleep enough last night. Sleep deprivation is a serious problem in our society today. In fact, the CDC, which is the US Center for Disease Control, has labeled insufficient sleep a public health epidemic. And what this means at the individual level. So here you're seeing just a map of the US showing the percent of people who are underslept as a function of where they live. So it's widespread. And it causes significant health impacts. So I know this is probably too small for you to see very well, but it increases your chances of having heart attacks, coronary heart disease, strokes, asthma, depression, arthritis. Lack of sleep is associated with a whole host of bad outcomes at the individual level. And in extreme cases, if you sleep deprive people long enough, it can lead to death. But if you zoom out, what does this mean for our societies? Sleep deprivation at this scale is not only bad for our collective health, but it also has really important implications for the safety and economic outlook of our societies. So sleep loss and sleep disorders are strongly increase the odds of falling asleep at the wheel, contributing to a car crash, and have also been implicated in disasters like the Chernobyl nuclear explosion, the 3 Mile Island nuclear explosion, the Challenger Discovery Shuttle explosion, and seem to have big impacts both through the effects on human health and through lost productivity on economic output of our societies. So as we're coming out of a pandemic that severely exacerbated our social fragmentation, I would argue that we urgently need to understand how social environments shape and are shaped by the sleep patterns of their members. And this is one of those questions that you can't actually do very well in people. This is actually a question where wild animal models, they're not just a pain, like primates are a terrible model for almost anything, but they have some advantages in this particular case because studying social sleep in humans raises a whole host of privacy concerns. There are a whole set of reasons why, if you want to understand the social dynamics of sleep, it's easier to do it in non-human animals as a starting spot than people. So what we've been focusing on, that isn't my be done, is it? Good. So we've been using baboons as a model system for trying to understand sleep as a social process. And so today, what I'm going to sort of show you is starting out with at the individual level, looking at how do individuals sleep in the wild, and how does the social environment impact that? What are the social dynamics of sleep? And finally, talk about some really confusing or strange, or anyway, I find it exciting information, data that we have suggesting that the social dynamics of sleep are actually structuring larger level patterns of sort of above group level, population level patterns of social interaction across baboon societies. So how do we know if this baboon is asleep or if he's just resting his eyes? Well, polysomnography is like the gold standard of sleep research. But you can imagine, so it involves measuring brain waves, heart, muscle tone, heart activity. But as you can imagine, a baboon isn't going to tolerate this. They'd pull those wires right off. So we're relying on accelerometry, the same sorts of things that would be in your Fitbit or your Oura Ring, as well as thermal videography to monitor and record data on the sleep patterns of entire groups of primates. And using this, we can differentiate with reasonable accuracy. It's about 86, our model has about 86% predictive power. between wakefulness, resting wakefulness, so you're still but you're not asleep, and actually being asleep in baboons using accelerometry alone. And sleep is particularly important. So like we tend to sleep in comfortable beds in very protected environments that are sheltered from the elements. Sleep for us is a relatively non-risky activity. But if you're a wild animal, what it means to sleep, this necessary biological process that all animals do, puts you in a state of reduced awareness, reduced ability to react to environmental stimuli, at a time when predators are frequently their most active. And so sleep can be very, very dangerous. And if you're a baboon and you make it to adulthood, the primary cause of adult mortality in baboons is being killed by one of these guys, by being killed by a leopard. And that danger, that risk of predation comes primarily at night. So we've done simultaneous tracking of leopards and baboons, and we've actually caught some using on sort of simultaneous GPS tracking actual predation events where leopards have infiltrated the sleeping sites of baboons and taken them. And just recently, I want you guys to watch this tree. As we started to use thermal video, we've actually been able to get a sense of how dangerous is this? How common is this? Did you see that? That's a leopard going up the tree. So what we find is that leopards are at and infiltrate baboon sleep sites on about 1 night out of 4 at our field site. So it's incredibly common. This surprised us quite a bit, but this sort of just how common it actually was. So we don't know, this leopard got scared away before he caught anybody. Who knows if he would have, if he hadn't been scared away. But this kind of data is giving us a whole new insight into what's going on in the nighttime lives of these animals, which basically we've been ignoring for the past years because we haven't had ways of seeing it. So if you're a baboon, you need a safe nighttime refuge, and there are 2 kind of important choices you have to make. You have to choose where on the landscape to sleep, those trees or that cliff. And then once a group has reached consensus about where to sleep, then comes this sort of internal negotiation about who gets to sleep where within that particular site. And both of these choices are important. So if you imagine this baboon, the group has decided on a sleep site, he has to decide on his sleep spot. Well, okay, he's probably the first guy making this decision, is weighing factors like factors about the physical structure of the site. So where is safe from predators, where is warm, where might be warm, what has good stability and is safe. But then the next animal entering this site has a changed decision-making space because all of a sudden there's a social component to the question. So it's predators, warmth, stability, and do I like this guy? Do I want to sleep with him or near him? And this process continues. And so at each stage of the decision-making process, animals are weighing a set of conditions that change and that are multifaceted and that are changing. And individuals can change their mind. I think I got overexcited with this animation, but I really like it, sorry. The point being, so what we're trying to do is track individuals and these kinds of decisions to understand how they are weighing the physical aspects of their sleep site, the social aspects of their sleep site, and then how those choices then impact their ability to get a good night's sleep using a combination of this remote tracking and accelerometry with thermal video. So this is one set of sleeping cliffs where they sleep. And to track these guys, we've been building computer vision models to identify baboons across these video clips or these video segments that we have, automate that process, and then be able to stitch their tracks together so that we actually have the movement. So when Bob enters the sleep site and chooses one sleep site, we can then track him to, he decided to move partway through the night. And we simultaneously have data on accelerometry, which lets us know something about their sleep outcomes. So This is just an example of one night sleep data where we've aggregated the accelerometry data. VEDBA is basically just a way of taking the triaxial 3-axis accelerometry down into a single value. And you can see that during the day, during the day, they're relatively active and then inactive at night, but you have these bursts of activity. Animals wake up, just same as you wake up in the middle of the night and do things or just roll over. So we can characterize sort of the overall sleep patterns of baboons. So this is just sort of the average. If you average all individuals across a data set, baboons are very consistent in when they go to bed and when they wake up. But on any particular night, you have these periods of wakefulness in the middle of the night. And there's incredibly strong synchrony within the group about wake up time and slightly less in terms of when they go to bed, which is slightly unexpected based on human data. So when you think about sleep, one of the defining features of sleep is that it is a homeostatic process. So if you don't sleep very well one night, you have rebound sleep the next, you sleep longer the next. And maybe you guys, after a week of workshop, will go rebound on the weekend with your sleep. And we find some very limited evidence for this in baboons. So total sleep time decreases if you've napped a lot the day before. It's not a huge effect. It's not a super impressive effect. I meant to get the data points in there. I mean, it's statistically significant, but it's not super impressive. Importantly though, the evidence for homeostatic regulation of sleep in baboons is actually really weak. So that's the only evidence that we have. How much you slept last night doesn't impact how much you sleep the next night. How much you slept last night doesn't impact how much you will nap tonight. So in contrast to humans, where this is a super robust pattern of homeostatic sleep regulation and sleep rebound after lack of sleep, we don't find that same pattern in baboons. Now, my hypothesis would be that they don't have access to artificial light. And so baboons may never actually be the kinds of like low sleep nights we actually find in the wild may not be sufficient to really require sleep rebound. That's, I guess, what I think is going on here. So we find relatively limited evidence of these sort of endogenous drivers of individual sleep behavior. But what about the social and the ecological environment? So we looked at both the location where baboons sleep as well as the social environment of their sleep site. And the troop of baboons that we were studying tends to sleep in this sort of set of trees along a river. So that's just the nighttime GPS data. They cluster in this set of trees. And the location where they choose to sleep actually matters. So it turns out that sleep tree 4 is just crap. It doesn't matter who sleeps there. Everybody has a bad night in sleep tree 4. So there's variation in the quality of these different trees, apparently, for baboons' experience of sleep. Location also matters, though, in a slightly more interesting way. So we used an information theoretic approach to show that baboons have preferences, like individual baboons have preferences for specific sleep trees. So Bob likes to sleep in 4, and Lucy likes to sleep in 1. And so, yeah, so they do have these preferences, and they sleep better when they're in their preferred tree. So tree 4 may be bad overall, but if that's his preferred tree, Bob sleeps well there, Lucy sleeps terribly there. So there's sort of this like familiarity seems to improve sleep quality. And we caught this really interesting. So within this particular data collection period, we caught a leopard attack. So we had a leopard infiltrate the sleep site. He didn't kill anybody, but it caused the group to switch sleep sites for a few nights before coming back to their typical sleep site. And so pre-attack, this is sort of like the standard levels of it's total sleep time standardized. On the night of the attack, surprisingly, baboons didn't sleep any worse than average, really. It's slightly higher variance, but I don't know. You had a leopard up there, everyone still slept like babies. However, when they changed sleep sites, that the first night in the new sleep site, individuals slept terribly. Now, this is a well-documented effect in humans that you guys are also probably experiencing, the first night effect. So people sleep terribly the first night away from home, and then very quickly reacclimatize to their new surroundings and sleep better. So we find the same sort of pattern in baboons that's like a very well-documented sleep phenomenon in people. So at an individual level, we also see a range of sort of individual level effects. So we have good sleepers in our baboon troop. We have bad sleepers. Males sleep more than females. Juveniles sleep less than adults. Both of those patterns are contrary to what you see in humans. In humans, women sleep better than men. Kids sleep longer than adults. You see the opposite pattern in baboons. And clear evidence for sorts of trade-offs between social and environmental factors. But as we move from the sort of more environmental side to the social side, and look at how individuals sleeping in the same site are influencing one another, we also see interesting results. So there is not really a huge body of theoretical literature about social sleep, because people haven't treated or thought about sleep in a social context very much. But the one hypothesis that exists is called one of the hypotheses that exists is called the sentinel hypothesis. And it's basically the idea that you benefit from sleeping in a group, not just by a dilution effect. So the fact that if a predator attacks, you're less likely to be the one who dies, but also because if you sleep in a group, you can sort of desynchronize your periods of sleeping and wakefulness so that you have sort of better coverage, better vigilance coverage across the night. So the idea that individuals it's not just that you have more eyes, but in fact that there's some sort of active desynchronization of sleep-wake cycles to create better vigilance coverage across the night. And so we looked at this pattern. And so as a starting point, this doesn't look very promising. Individuals don't sleep more if they're sleeping in a tree with more group mates. They in fact sleep worse. So the more individuals you're sleeping with, the less time you are successfully sleeping. That's not consistent with the sentinel hypothesis. But we also wanted to look at more specifically at this question of synchronization. So what you're seeing here is sort of across the x-axis is time over the night. And on the y-axis, each line is an individual baboon. And then the yellows are periods of wakefulness, and the black is periods of sleep. So you've got 24:57 awake and asleep, and there's the rest of the group. So you can see at 6, they're still mostly awake, and then they start to go to sleep. But there's a lot of like up, down, awake, asleep going on. So we did a set of randomizations to ask if what we were seeing was more or less synchronized than you'd expect by chance, basically shifting the time series of individuals to create kind of, to maintain the temporal patterning within the data set, but break the between individual time link. And so what we found, so here what you're seeing is the proportion of individuals doing the same thing in our randomizations, and the proportion of time that at least one individual is awake in our randomized data sets with the empirical data. So in the empirical data, individuals are more synchronized than you'd expect by chance, and there's less time than you'd expect that the proportion of time that at least one individual is awake is actually lower in the empirical data set than it is in the randomizations. So both of these suggest that there's none of this sort of anti-synchrony going on. They're in fact more synchronized than you'd expect. So we don't find evidence for the sentinel hypothesis. What we do find is strong evidence for awakening cascades, so social transmission of wakefulness flowing through our groups. So your chance of waking up increases dramatically with the number of other individuals that are awake in your group in the previous time step. And when we do a network-based diffusion model, what we find is that 10.5% of awakening events are a direct cause. What we find is that awakening events flow through the social network of the group, so that social affiliates are basically waking up one another. And it to a lesser degree also seems to flow through the dominance hierarchy of the group. And what's interesting is that we're still working on getting this fully embedded in space, But in the sort of, so we don't have the proximity network in this one model yet. That's what we're working on at the moment. But the sort of workarounds we've done to ask ourselves, okay, so it's trivial that awakenings flow through your affiliation network if your affiliation network is synonymous with your who you sleep with your proximity network, right? Then it's just like you wake up the individuals that you're close to. What we find actually though is that's not true. Individuals aren't waking up the individuals immediately in their proximity. What seems to be happening is that when a baboon wakes up in the middle of the night, it may choose to move to a new position within the sleep site. And if it does, it very strongly moves towards its close, I'm going to use the F word, I'm sorry, friends, towards its close social affiliates within the group. And it doesn't wake up the individuals that it was sleeping with in its original position, but it does wake up the individuals that it moves towards. So we think that's what's going on here. But overall, what this means is that social individuals lose about 15 minutes of sleep a night. Now that doesn't sound like a huge effect, but actually across all of the various things that we've looked at, this is a pretty substantial effect size. And these sorts of small sleep losses end up adding up, and we think may have important implications for how individuals are interacting and coordinating their social interactions during the daytime. So we think that nighttime behavior may be spilling over and influencing the tenor of group interactions during the day. So just to finish up, if I have time. Cool. So moving from within group sleep dynamics to between groups sleep dynamics. Baboon troops, of course, aren't socially isolated. They live in a population and in a neighborhood of other social groups that they're interacting with. In this particular species, those interactions tend to be aggressive. They don't like different baboon troops are relatively xenophobic. They don't really like each other. When they meet, they tend to fight. And in our study system, this is a data set that we're still building, but we have data currently from 4 neighboring groups. And on this landscape, safe sleep sites are a limited resource. There are relatively few places that have either like high trees or nice cliffs that we think the defining feature of what makes this place good and this place bad is about leopard access. We don't know that for sure, but there are certainly tree groves that the baboons will not sleep in, and also cliffs that they will not sleep in. But they have a relatively limited set of sleep sites, and many of them are shared between groups. So like the same sleep site will be used by multiple different groups on different nights. And it actually turns out that sometimes baboon troops will share sleep sites. Now, they don't do that any more than you'd expect by chance. We don't see basically any evidence of mutual attraction to wanting to sleep together. But when they do sleep together, interesting things happen. So first of all, their sleep efficiency drops, as well as sort of, so they sleep less efficiently, they wake up more often, and they lose about 30 minutes of sleep when they share a sleep site with a neighboring group. However, this sleep site sharing, while it disrupts their sleep, it seems to catalyze social tolerance between the groups. So what you're seeing here is interacting groups colored according, so each color is a different group. The blue and the green group slept together, and then the next day they're traveling together as if they were a single unit. So what we find is that after sharing a sleep site, 2 groups which normally would only fight can travel together for the longest, sort of the outlier, the longest period that we have is up to 3 days of co-travel, which is just very, very strange for this species. And it's particularly interesting because it seems to us like potentially the basis or kind of an incipient form of a multi-level society. So a society where you don't only have differentiated social relationships within your group, but the groups themselves have differentiated social relationships with their neighbors. And putting on my anthropologist hat, this is interesting because this is a defining feature of human social relationships, that we have these multi-level societies where it's not just within the group we live with or within our language group, but that we have these sort of multiple levels of social organization at the that structure our societies. And what we're thinking is that sleep site sharing may may sort of create conditions where these kinds of higher order social relationships can easily form. So there are a bunch of other species, so guinea fowl, gelato baboons, a variety of the snub-nosed monkeys that also have multi-level societies, and where that also have very limited sleep site access, and where sleep site sharing is important. And the thing about sleep sites is, like, unlike food sources and other kinds of resources, they are shareable. You can share a sleep site, and yes, there's a slight sleep cost, and maybe that sleep cost is a true cost, as in, like, maybe you end up in a less good sleep spot, and so you are paying a cost. But it may also be that in these cases where two groups come together and sleep in the same site, that sleep loss is an adaptive sleep loss, where they're sacrificing sleep for something social that they're getting good. So it may not, but whether it's a positive or a negative is not clear yet. But the kinds of open savanna habitats that baboons live on have long been used as kind of a model for thinking about the kinds of environments our early ancestors would have experienced as they transitioned from more arboreal tropical apes into more terrestrial bipedal apes, who still would have needed to be safe at night. And so I think it points to an interesting question about the ways in which limited but shareable resources on a landscape may structure societies at above the sort of individual dyadic group level instead at the population level. So this is sort of a major direction that research in my group is going in the next years. And so I guess, like, for me, the key take homes of what we found so far is that social and ecological pressures matter. I mean, like, sleep is a massively important biological phenomenon. It's imperative. We can't live without it. We don't even understand why we sleep. Like, sleep remains a real mystery. And sleeping in the lab is not the same thing as sleeping in the wild. And I would say that we need to move our thoughts about sleep research into more socially and ecologically relevant contexts if we want to understand what's going on. Sleep is also a social behavior, and the collective dynamics, the interactions among sleeping individuals shape the costs and benefits that they experience. And it's a multi-scale process. So it does seem to be shaping sleep, and sleeping together seems to be shaping not only relationships between individuals, but also relationships between groups. So I'm going to end with a thanks to my collaborative network here at the Max Planck. And I'm happy to take questions if I still have time.
I was just wondering of this number you gave, that on average they use about 15 minutes of sleep per night due to these changes of groups. Mm-hmm. Do you find, because I imagine that this is an average and you have a distribution of how much they use, do you find that the individuals then the next day adapt their social structure to maybe become less social during the day so then they can sleep more, so then their friends don't bother them at night? So do you find a predictive relationship between how much you were disturbed the night before and how social you are the day after?
So we don't know yet, but that's part of what we're sort of doing. So we've been in permit struggles since before COVID, and our permits came through on Friday. So we will be back in the field doing new research again, which is really exciting. But I mean, I guess my prediction would be, I mean, like, what we know from human studies, right, is that when you are poorly slept, like when you are sleep deprived, a whole variety of your sort of social cognitive processes, your ability to read emotions, your ability to basically respond appropriately in social conditions is reduced, it's lowered. And so the question, like I would predict that you would find that like underslept individuals, that you see changes in their social behavior the next day. That would be my prediction. It might be that they become less social. It might be that they end up engaging in more fights because they're not following appropriate social responses as well, or they're not reading the room. And whether that, if we see that pattern, whether that is sort of a choice that is a functional choice, or whether that's a constraint, would have to be teased apart.
Maybe I can quickly jump in here. I was wondering about this kind of random control of the synchrony of sleep. If you account for this cascades of awakening, right, based on the network structure, based on the hierarchy structure, will those results still hold? Like, that's going to produce some level of synchrony just based on the kind of the constraints of when people wake one another up. But if you account for that, you might still get some higher than chance synchrony. Yeah. So what you're saying is that, or asynchrony. Yeah. So just to repeat back your question, what you're saying is that if we account for the fact that you have these awakening cascades, like if we were to create a null model where that's accounted for, is it possible that we'd see pattern or a signal of asynchrony? So I'm going to throw the question back at you, because in our randomizations, we're using the real data. So to some degree that those cascades are, no, but we're breaking the cascades. Yeah, it's true. It's a good question. We haven't done it yet. We haven't done it yet, so I don't know. But it would be worth doing. And okay, I'd be curious to hear your suggestion of how we might do it.
Yeah, so I was wondering, after two troops that would normally be hostile share. Okay, got it. Okay, so after two troops that would normally be hostile to one another share a night together in the same area, I'm curious, when do they split? Like, what kind of factors cause them to split afterwards? I think it's an interesting decision.
Yeah, so that is a really interesting question. So as these two, they wake up together, they start to move together. What is it that drives them apart? I would say that we don't yet have the resolution of the data to answer that question, because in this particular multi-group data set, we only had one or two individuals per group tagged, as opposed to having the whole group tagged. So trying to understand the sort of the social process that's causing that divergence. We don't have the data for that yet, but we will soon.
Hi, thank you for the talk. One question I had was just about the relationship. So I know you used the word friends, but if you look at that, like human data, and for kids specifically, they would be going to like caregivers as this like umbrella of safety, maybe they could go to sleep with. And is there a way that you could get some kind of data of like what type of relationship it is, if there is a caregiver presence or caregiver effect of, or akin with the baboons going up to a specific person if it's their caregiver?
Can I hear the question, or do I need to repeat it online?
I think we should be able to hear it this because of the microphone.
Okay.
Get the confirmation maybe for someone. Maybe just do a very.
Okay, so if I understood correctly, the question was, in humans, does it matter kind of who they're sleeping with, and if it's a caregiver, does that change the dynamics of sleep versus someone they're less close to? And then maybe tying that to baboons and the social relationships within baboons. Is that, did I understand correctly? Okay. So that's a question, like, I don't know the answer. We are starting a new collaboration here at Konstanz. One of the great things about Konstanz is that we have this really interdisciplinary community of researchers. So there's actually someone from the education department that we've just started a collaboration with, and she studies the social dynamics of kids within schools. And so we're going to start tracking kids' sleep in sort of social and asocial contexts, and then tying that to sort of these behavioral synchronization, behavioral cooperation tasks within schools, as well as sort of the natural behavior within schools. So we might have some data. It's unclear to me how much co-sleeping is actually happening in this particular population. So we're doing a survey right now to try to find out how much co-sleeping with kids, with caretakers and their kids is happening. When it comes to the baboons, I mean, one of the questions that I had when I saw the fact that, like, you see this reverse pattern where male baboons sleep more than female baboons, whereas in humans, women sleep more than men. And female baboons for most of their adult lives have a small squiggly thing clinging to them all night long. And so I think this question of like how mother-infant sleep synchronizes or doesn't, and the impact of co-sleeping on both the mother and the juvenile, infant or juvenile, I think is a really interesting one. And I don't have answers yet, but we didn't have a big enough sample size to look at whether mothers with clinging infants slept better or worse than females without infants currently. But we should soon, hopefully, have enough data to start teasing that question apart.
Hi, thanks. Fascinating talk. I was interested by the concept of the sociome. I think it's a very interesting concept. And I was just wondering, how far do you think that analogy goes? Because, you know, on the one hand, I'm assuming this analogy is the connectome, right? Right.
Or to the genome, or to the proteome, or to the, to
No,
omics.
Okay, I was thinking connectome, and there, you have networks where, nodes are actual cells and links are, actual parts of cells, so they're like physical pathways. And then in social networks, it can be different kinds of representations, right? It can be like social hierarchies or like actual social interactions. So I was just wondering how far that analogy goes, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think this question of like when we use data, aggregate data to create social networks within within a baboon society, and maybe it's an affiliative social network, or maybe it's a dominance hierarchy. To what degree are those real, or to what degree are we actually measuring something that exists versus something that is just our way of interpreting a set of interactions that doesn't have any real, that isn't representing whatever is meaningful to the animals themselves. I guess that my quasi-philosophical answer would be like, I think there is a real thing that is the shared relationship, like in a baboon society, right? Like there is a shared set of, there's a history of shared and repeated interaction that has occurred between any two nodes in this network, right? That influences how this node responds to this node, and that very clearly baboons track. They don't only track their own relationships, but they're actually tracking third-party relationships. So like if you simulate a fight so you're doing a playback experiment. So you've got a baboon that's kind of like off to the group, and you're playing back, you're using a speaker to play back sort of auditory stimuli. You can play back the vocalizations made in a fight that upheld the dominance hierarchy, or for example, that overturned the existing status quo. They pay more attention to the overturning the status quo playback experiment. So they're not only tracking their own relationships, they're also keeping track of the relationships of other individuals in their group, which says to me that there is a real thing there. Whether that's captured in the kinds of, even when you get to like multiplex networks, whether we're capturing what's relevant to the animals, I think until you start actually doing experiments to test that question, I think it remains open.
That's it. Thanks.
I think we have time for one quick question, but we're changing.
Thank you so
so much for the really interesting talk. I kind of have a similar question to the first one, but on the individual level. So we know that the groups like traveling together, even though they would technically not like each other, just sleeping together. But if I have an individual, as an individual, I'm moving towards people I like at night. Does that affect the social bond on the next day? Because imagining this as a human, I feel like if someone cost me 15 minutes of sleep because they were close to me, I would probably not like.
Sorry. Get out of your way. I think okay, so I'm on a repeating loop. We don't know the answer yet. My guess is that if it seems plausible to me that that could exist, right? But my guess is that in the grand scheme of a relationship, I mean, these animals live together. These are long-lived animals. They're living together for 30, 40 years. My guess is that like 15 minutes of sleep loss is so minor in the grand scheme of, in the grand scheme of the relationship. My gut instinct would be saying it's not going to have an impact. I think one of the things that I would be really interested in finding out is, do you position yourself differently within a sleep site when you need, like are they sort of aware? Is there any evidence that they're sort of strategically choosing a sleep site based on, oh, I'm exhausted tonight, I don't care, like the social stuff is less important to me right now, I'm going to sleep out on this far branch where no one's going to bother me. Like, so sort of do they modulate their own behavioral decisions as a function of their internal state? And yeah, I don't know, I can't tell you the answer, but I think they might. Yeah.
Right, thank you so much, Meg.
Yeah, thank you.